Radio Free Innsmouth, episode 211. Going back to our roots with this one because we will be covering death metal. If all that visual K crap made you forget what death metal sounds like, yeah, it's like this.
And we like that.
This week it's a band that way more people should be familiar with. The formidable Morpheus Descends. Morpheus, from the great state of New York.
I know what you're thinking.
Why should I care about this random death metal band I've never heard of?
Listen, fuckhead!
Please open the booklet to your copy of Suffocation's 1991 album, Effigy of the Forgotten, which you no doubt already own if you're into death metal.
You son of a bitch!
You'll notice in the picture, they got all the dudes from the band. What is Terrence Hobbs wearing? A fucking Morpheus shirt. In fact, this picture was pretty instrumental into getting me into a lot of bands, because as you can see, Doug Cerrito is wearing a Ripping Corpse shirt. That's the first place I ever heard of them. And then Josh Barone is wearing a Deceased shirt, which convinced me to give that band a listen finally. And then Mike Smith has an Atheist shirt on, but I already fucking knew about them. I fucking first heard that Suffocation album right around the time Relapse Records was doing all of those Atheist reissues. But that's besides the point. Listen, if it's good enough for Terrence Hobbs, particularly Effigy of the Forgotten Terrence Hobbs, then it's good enough for you.
You fucking goddamn fucker!
So Morpheus Descends is perhaps the greatest New York death metal band that does not end in Ation. In fact, depending on what kind of mood I'm in, they may in fact be better than Immolation, Incantation, and honestly even Suffocation, alright? They're really fucking good. And they started out that way right on their first EP, entitled Adipocere, which funnily enough was not pressed by Adipocere Records. Instead it was by Seraphic Decay, another very important cult death metal label. And even at this very early date, October of 1991, you can already hear most of the Morpheus Descends songwriting trademarks, such as starting out a song with a rather simple mid-paced riff that they proceed to add more and more elements to, such as drums and vocals, locking into a groove from that beginning riff before whacking it with a very nasty dose of counterpoint that echoes that initial riff, but is almost sort of a clever inversion of it. This is a band that has mastered the art of transitioning between sections of the song. Like right here, where they kind of take the end part of that one riff and just start looping it over and over, so you can tell they're building up to something. Also a lot of rhythmic variation, playing riffs that contain the same notes, but just different sorts of drum beats under them. And full-stop transitions leading into very ripping fast parts. Does that sound familiar? Because it should. Suffocation was all about this shit on their third album, Pierced From Within, which came out years after this, and I gotta think Morpheus Descends was an influence on that. They also have these really weird sort of breakdowns, but they're not like pickup change breakdowns. They're more just like really dark, gloomy, and dismal, like sonic dirges. Very similar to what you might hear in Infestor, another band that I'm pretty sure was influenced by Morpheus. At any rate, most Infestor fans that I've met were into Morpheus Descends, and vice versa. Most Morpheus Descends fans I've met have been into Infestor. So if you like Infestor and you haven't heard Morpheus Descends, I mean, please keep listening to the episode, because I worked pretty hard on it, but you could probably just go out and get all the Morpheus Descends shit right now. You'll love it. You might remember earlier I said they were called Morpheus Descends. Morpheus. And this is because this is a band that is no stranger to hardship. The first hardship they faced was having to change their name from Morpheus to Morpheus Descends, which probably screwed with them a little bit commercially. And this one's kind of tricky, because a lot of times you get two bands with the same name, and in the case of Sacrilege from the UK and Sacrilege from Gothenburg, both bands are amazing. Or in the case of...
I mean, there's Chuck Schuldiner's band Death. Good band, actually.
And the old punk band Death that literally no one had ever fucking heard of until the real band Death, the death metal band Death, got big and are honestly only well regarded because they had like black people in it and because dickheads like to
actually
a nigga about death metal.
아니 촬영했던 거 하다 보면은
No, it's cool. See, I've been reliably informed by a coalition of the obese calling themselves, let's see here, the dissident right, that the country Italy and personages of Italian descent in general
actually all black
And my last name's Dago as fuck, so despite my outward appearance, I clearly have one of these coveted naughty word passes that are all the rage with the kids nowadays. But anyways, there's another band named Morpheus that forced the subject of our show today, Morpheus, to change their name to Morpheus Descends. But it's tricky because it's not like both Morpheuses are equal in terms of quality, but it's also not really like one is fucking great and the other is fucking terrible. Because here's what the Swedish Morpheus sounds like. You know, the production's kind of weak, but the music itself ain't half bad. It's sort of this really weird, almost avant-garde style of death metal. Very different from the ultra-traditionalist strains of Morpheus Descends. With some nice incorporation of spooky melodies, and a lot of very odd but interesting musical choices, such as incorporation of overlaid shriek growls and narration with these like weird winding, sort of early At the Gates type riffs. It makes for an interesting listen. So there's not really anything wrong with the official band Morpheus, the Swedish one, although I do like the other projects that the musicians behind that band were involved in better, such as Mastication in Egypt. But I felt like they did deserve a mention in this episode that is about Morpheus. Morpheus Descends. I just kind of wish they were either a little bit better so I could feign surprise for comedic effect, or a whole lot worse so that I could dunk on them properly. One band that should never be dunked on is Morpheus Descends. So they change their name to Morpheus Descends from Morpheus, and they get signed by JL America, which is a really weird label, sort of has a bad reputation for possibly being a ripoff label, but put out a whole lot of like very odd death metal. And they fit right into the tradition of that label because the cover of this album, Ritual of Infinity, holy shit, is it fucking bonkers. It's like almost sort of abstract and it looks a bit like a painted collage. And that seems to be a thing for this label because they also put out the first Organic Infest album, and that one had really weird fucking production and really weird artwork. Both covers were actually painted by Brad Moore, who is probably more famous for doing the album covers for Argus nowadays. So the cover art's weird. The production, while not being as weird as it is on that Organic Infest album, I mean, I actually fucking love that album, and I even kind of enjoy that it sounds so weird, but I feel bad for the band because I feel like having a production job that odd really fucked with having them listened to by like a whole bunch of metalheads. It deserved better. Morpheus doesn't sound that fucking weird, but their first album does have a very deviant from standard death metal production. It has a pretty thin guitar tone, a very loud bass, and very loud popping drums, but the songwriting is still there, where they start songs out with like a very simple sort of like groovy riff, speed up the drums under it, and then full stop into a fast section. That's back from the debut EP and it has been elaborated on immensely with much more complex songwriting and a whole lot of groove to it. You could see why, dudes from Suffocation are into this band because they sound a little bit similar. But Morpheus is less concerned with overall brutality and more for that sort of dismal atmosphere I mentioned earlier. This is very atmospheric, nasty, sort of like coming out of a cemetery type death metal. Much more atmospheric than is common for most American bands at the time. But there's still a potent amount of groove as you're hearing right here. This is very much a New York death metal style riff. But it's these tremolo riffs that are sort of like their signature sound in the transitions back into the groove. But remember those like winding weird tremolo riffs. Those will become an important signature thing for Morpheus Descends in the future. Along with, their very spooky, lurching, oddly atmospheric breakdowns. You never thought you'd hear a breakdown described as atmospheric, but this band's all about that shit, man. And it's why I enjoy them so much. It uses a lot of conventional death metal elements like tremolo riffs and breakdowns and transitions between riffs and whatnot, but they do so in a way that is pretty much utterly unique to Morpheus Descends. And I wish this album had come out on like a bigger label than JL America with a more standard sounding death metal production, because while I enjoy this production quite a bit, if this album had been on like Roadrunner, these guys would have been as big as Suffocation. I can almost guarantee it. And now we come to the second level of trials and tribulations suffered by this band after the name change. As I mentioned earlier, JL America was a very fly-by-night production, so they're not around anymore, and Morpheus Descends has to self-release their 1994 album, Chronicles of the Shadowed Ones. This album was super fucking rare for a very long time. And it's a damn shame because, like, shit, dude, I didn't fucking hear this until... I mean, I'm not going to say recently, but relatively recently, you know, at least 5 or so years after I heard the first one. But nowadays, Dark Descent has seen fit to reissue Chronicles of the Shadowed Ones, along with the Adipocere EP and the Ritual of Infinity album, in a beautifully sleek black box set. It also includes a poster, 2 CDs with the entire Morpheus Descends discography. It even has a fucking DVD with it. But I mean, you know, this band was around in the 90s, so it's all camcorder recordings at concerts. It mostly sounds like this. But it's still fucking cool to have, and it's just so damn sexy looking. Look, I'm not saying that I might sleep with it under my pillow. I'm just saying, if you could find it, you should get this. It's fucking awesome, and it's got all the Morpheus Descends you'll ever need. But for most people, this was the first time they heard the second Morpheus Descends album, Chronicles of the Shadowed Ones, which is sort of a concept album about Brian Lumley's Necroscope novels. If you don't know that guy, he's like a really good Lovecraftian influenced author. And I gotta say, as much as I love Ritual of Infinity, like, that was a very important album for me in high school, mostly because Brett Stevens had it on his list of essential death metal albums that I found when I was, dude, like a sophomore. I doubt I would have heard of it otherwise, so thanks for that. But as much as I love that album, Chronicles of the Shadowed Ones is probably my favorite thing Morpheus Descends has ever done. The production is even more crepitant sounding than it was last time, and it really fits the music, which is much darker and just kind of like nastier. Definitely a heavier emphasis on atmosphere than their prior material, moving even farther away from standard death metal into a realm of very unique, dark music. And I really love the drumming on this album in particular. Sam Zera is great on every Morpheus Descends album, but on this one he really stands out, utilizing these odd rolling beats and lots of drum fills to sort of accentuate the different ups and downs of the guitars. Very unique style. He's actually the live drummer for Mortician nowadays. But here's those weird tremolo riffs. They are much more prominent on this album, and a lot of times they'll like crank out a melody for a bit and then it'll go dun 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 to like end it. So it's a whole lot of just like wavy, undulating stuff. Speaking of signature Morpheus Descends songwriting techniques, full stops leading into weird riffs, which in turn lead into the spooky breakdowns I've been talking about. They're all over the place on this album. But see, check out that drum beat. That's so weird. I love it. But yeah, it's just fucking... goddamn, son, this shit's heavy. I'm having a hard time accurately portraying through my verbiage just how goddamn heavy this album is, but it is a banger. It's a certified hood classic, and if you're going to listen to one Morpheus Descends album, I would say make it this one. And I know that's kind of going against the grain because Ritual of Infinity is definitely a classic, but Chronicles of the Shadowed Ones, man, 10 out of 10, one of the best death metal albums of all time. But
the benefits don't stop there.
3 years later, they put out an EP entitled Horror of the Truth, which has probably my favorite production they've ever used. It's a little bit cleaner, but it's also way more reverbed, almost kind of black metal-y, and it fits how dark and mystical their music has become. Musically, it actually reminds me a lot of certain moments on the first Dark Throne album back when they were a death metal band, mostly because of the rolling percussion and just these like creepy sounding riffs. Cool stuff, but then it goes into, you know, the spooky breakdowns. You might notice that the vocals are a little bit different on this album. That's because that's Tom Stevens from Nocturnal, of all bands, from New Jersey, taking over for the original Morpheus Descends vocalist, who was apparently having a tough time and actually ended up dying of a heroin overdose in 2005. Like I've reiterated, this is a band that has been plagued by hardship since the beginning. One thing that is not hard for them are their signature weird atmospheric breakdowns. On this album, they even have a little bit of melody to the tail ends of them, which makes for a very spooky, dark sort of affect. Much like its immediate predecessor, this is a very overlooked piece of music. At least it's on a label this time, but it's not a label I've ever heard of. and I can't find anything else that label ever put out, so it might as well have been independently released. But like I said, Dark Descent from Blackened Crypts box set includes everything on this EP, so you have no excuse. Go and get it, or at least listen to it on YouTube or something. Sheesh. Unfortunately, after this, Morpheus Descends broke up in 1998. But this is not the end of their musical odyssey. Andy Newton, the bassist on Chronicles of the Shadowed Ones and Horror of the Truth, went on to start a black metal band called Typhus that are probably more famous nowadays for having the sort of lyrical content that makes the dudes from Profanatica go, chill! Like, shit, dude, it's pretty aggressive. But musically, there's a lot of overlap with Morpheus Descends' songwriting, and that there's these very long tremolo phrases, frequent use of full stops leading into new riffs. And a lot of it just sounds very death metal-y. Like, if you downtune this, you could see this kind of shit showing up on a Morpheus Descends album. That's a very Morpheus Descends sounding riff. And they also do that Morpheus Descends trick where they're playing the same riff with a different drum beat under it to keep things interesting and transition to new sections of the song. But yeah, no, it's still black metal, as you can tell by riffs like this. Funnily enough, Robert Jentzsch, the guitarist from Morpheus Descends throughout all of their career, ended up joining Typhus later on as a bassist. But speaking of Robert Jentzsch, first of all, what a fucking name. Perfect for a death metal band like Morpheus Descends. It sounds very aggressive. It rhymes with stench. Robert Jentzsch. But this guy, he kept going with the death metal because he joined another band, also playing bass, called Mausoleum, that has so far put out 2 albums on Razorback Records. And it's kind of Morpheus Descends-y sounding, right? You know, it's very dark, it's crepitant. It utilizes a lot of the same tempo variation techniques, repeating the end parts of riffs to lead into transitions. Also, there's a lot of full stops, but you might start to notice something when those full stops happen. There's something else going on with this album. You can already tell with the vocals, I'm willing to bet, depending how long you've been into death metal. Listen to how those vocals are phrased. Does that sound like anybody to you? Because it sure sounds a whole hell of a lot like Autopsy to me. And that wah pedal just sealed the deal. This is total Autopsy worship, this project. And it's on Razorback Records, so it's not quite as like dark and gloomy as Morpheus Descends is. There's a little bit more like B-movie camp goofiness to it, which makes sense because the album's fucking called Cadaveric Displays of Ghoulish Ghastliness, you know, like you're hearing right now. There's samples from movies, which is kind of funny because Morpheus Descends' drummer went on to be in Mortician. But yeah, I do enjoy Typhus and Mausoleum quite a bit, but not to the same extent that I love Morpheus Descends. Luckily, in 2015, coinciding with the release of that box set, the OG lineup of Morpheus Descends gets back together, and included within that box set are 2 new songs. And honestly, it's like the band never left, because this sounds just like old Morpheus Descends. Maybe a little bit more like Ritual of Infinity than it does like Chronicles of the Shadowed Ones, but it's classic Morpheus Descends either way. Most importantly, it's very energetic, or at least as energetic as a band as dark and dismal sounding as Morpheus Descends can manage. I'm usually skeptical of a lot of these reunions, but I think the fact that all these guys, they're not like getting back together out of a sense of nostalgia after having not played music for a while. These guys kept their metal stuff going outside of Morpheus Descends breaking up, and so when they felt that the time was right, they got back together and put out new material that would make fans of the older stuff proud, and that's the way to do it. Very similar to Uncanny from Sweden in that respect, or Wombbath. You know, no cash grabs here. Hopefully they'll release like a new full length or at least more material, because this shit is actually pretty darn good. So that's Morpheus Descends. Classic stuff, infinitely better than whatever retro death flavor of the week band all these nerds are currently hyping. Hopefully you enjoyed the episode. Hopefully you check out some more Morpheus Descends if you get the chance. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.
What the fuck are you doing? You can't even shut off a stream, you fucking drunk.